5 Terrifying True Scary Stories. Story 1, The Old Mirror, by Emily B. The cool autumn breeze blew through the streets of Salem, carrying with it the leaves that heralded the arrival of a new cycle. Emily, with her usual curiosity for objects that carried stories, decided to spend the afternoon exploring antique stores. She loved how each object seemed to whisper secrets from the past, waiting for someone who could hear. As she entered Salem Antique, a small store full of curiosities, her eyes were immediately drawn to a faded silver mirror. There was something about it that seemed more alive, more mysterious than the other objects in the store. The mirror, with its ornately carved frame, seemed to contain an ocean of stories on its polished surface. "It's from the 19th century, coming straight from an old mansion here in Salem," explained the salesman, noticing his interest. "They say it belonged to a famous writer of Gothic novels." Intrigued and unable to resist, Emily decided to buy the mirror. As the salesman carefully packed it, she imagined how this antique object would perfectly complement her apartment, a place already filled with old books and works of art. When she got home, she found the perfect place for the mirror, an empty wall in her bedroom. The reflection captured there seemed almost magical, illuminating the room with an ethereal glow that only antique objects possess. Over the next few days, Emily began to notice small peculiarities about the mirror. At first, they were just small distortions, as if the wavy glass revealed scenes that didn't correspond to her quiet room. Once, she swore she saw a shadow pass by her reflection, even though she was completely alone in the house. She tried to dismiss these occurrences as tricks of the light, or perhaps the effects of her fertile imagination, fueled by the many horror stories she read and wrote. However, as the days went by, the visions became clearer, more defined. A figure, a woman dressed in old clothes, began to appear in the corner of the mirror, watching her with a spine-chilling intensity. One night, while Emily was writing in her diary, she looked up to find the woman's gaze reflected. The figure now clearly outlined behind her in the mirror. Her heart racing, she turned quickly, only to find the room empty, with no sign of the sinister presence the mirror insisted on showing. That sight was a turning point. It could no longer be just her imagination. Something was happening, something she couldn't explain, but which she felt was deeply real and disturbing. Emily knew she needed to find out more about the mirror and its history. Perhaps the sales clerk could offer more information, or perhaps there were records of that writer that she could investigate. Determined, she decided that the next day she would return to the antique store. The next morning, with the overcast sky foreshadowing a typical fall rain, Emily returned to the antique store. The little bell on the door jingled, announcing her entrance, and the sales assistant immediately recognized her with a warm smile. "Back so soon? Has the mirror piqued your interest even more?" he asked, already anticipating the reason for her visit. Emily explained the disturbing visions she had seen in the mirror. The salesman listened carefully, his eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and concern. "That mirror? There have always been rumors," he began, lowering his voice as if he feared being overheard. "They say it belonged to Eliza Morgan, a writer known not only for her novels, but for her involvement with the occult. When she passed away, many of her belongings were dispersed. This particular mirror is said to have unusual properties." Armed with this new information, Emily spent the rest of the day at the local library, going through old newspapers and books that might give her more clues about Eliza Morgan. She discovered that Eliza was a controversial figure in Salem, often involved in scandals due to her esoteric parties and mysterious circle of acquaintances. Each piece of information only intensified the mystery and increased Emily's determination to discover the mirror's true power. She copied down various articles and notes, deciding to investigate every possible connection between Eliza and the supernatural. As the days went by, the apparitions in the mirror not only continued, but intensified. Now, Eliza's figure appeared almost daily, sometimes watching Emily, other times seeming to try to communicate something. The visions were accompanied by almost inaudible whispers, as if the wind carried messages that Emily could not yet understand. One night, while Emily was reading Eliza's diaries that she had found in the library, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air became heavier, charged with a static electricity that made Emily's skin shiver. Raising her eyes to the mirror, she saw Eliza clearly for the first time, the woman's expression one of desperation and urgency. Instinctively, Emily approached the mirror, her hand hesitantly reaching out to touch the cold surface. The moment her fingers touched the glass, a wave of images flooded her mind. Visions of esoteric parties, occult rituals, and a dark object being buried in the garden of Eliza's mansion. Frightened, but now irrevocably involved, Emily knew she could no longer ignore what the mirror was trying to show her. She needed to fully understand Eliza's story and the buried object, suspecting that it might be the key to solving the mystery of the mirror. Concerned about the growing manifestations and spurred on by the visions she had received, Emily turned to her neighbor, Mrs. Alden, a woman known in the community for her knowledge of spirituality and occult practices. The neighbor listened attentively to Emily's story, nodding with an air of seriousness. "You're not just dealing with a mirror, Emily. You're dealing with a portal that has somehow been opened, and now you don't know how to close it," explained Mrs. Alden, as together they prepared the necessary items for a sealing ritual. The storm brewing outside was almost foreboding, with lightning illuminating the night sky and thunder that seemed to echo Emily's inner turmoil. Inside the room, they formed a circle around the mirror with candles, rock salt, and specific herbs. "When we begin, do not interrupt, no matter what you see or hear," Mrs. Alden instructed, lighting the candles one by one. The two began to recite ancient words, the energy of the ritual growing as the wind howled outside. As the ritual reached its climax, Eliza's figure in the mirror seemed to struggle, as if it were being pulled back into the darkness from which it had come. Emily held an amulet that Mrs. Alden had given her, feeling the weight of her responsibility, not just to herself, but to the entity that had somehow become part of her life. With a final scream audible only in the world reflected by the mirror, Eliza's figure disappeared, and the mirror fell silent. The storm outside began to subside, as if nature were responding to the closing of the portal. Emily and Mrs. Alden breathed a sigh of relief, their clothes soaked with sweat and the previous tension. "We thought it was over," said Mrs. Alden, but her eyes betrayed a lingering caution. "Let's keep an eye on the mirror. Old spirits are cunning and persistent." In the days that followed, Emily felt a calm she hadn't experienced since before she bought the mirror. She started writing again, channeling her experience into a story that, she hoped, would only be fictional. However, a part of her knew she had to remain vigilant. One morning, as she was passing through the hallway, her gaze was caught by a reflection in the small bathroom mirror. There she was, Emily, with her mug of coffee and a subtle shadow in the background. Her heart stopped. She moved closer, the reflection becoming clearer. It wasn't her imagination. Eliza's figure was there, more subtle but undeniably present. The sight of the figure in the small bathroom mirror left Emily cold. She blinked several times, hoping that the image was a figment of her tired imagination, but the shadow remained, a silent reminder that the ritual had perhaps not been completely successful. With her heart beating fast, Emily ran to Mrs. Alden's house, seeking advice and, perhaps more importantly, reassurance. "She's back, isn't she?" were the first words Emily said as soon as the door opened. Mrs. Alden led her inside, concern marking her features. "We're going to need a different approach," she said, pondering the new revelation. "It seems that by breaking the mirror, we don't seal the entity, we just release it from its physical prison." Emily felt torn between fear and determination. "What can I do? I can't live like this, always looking over my shoulder, seeing shadows in every reflection." "We'll need to do more research. Maybe there's something in Eliza's text that we've missed," suggested Mrs. Alden, offering Emily a tea that seemed to have more herbs to soothe than to taste. Over the next few days, Emily immersed herself in Eliza's writings, looking for any clue that might have been overlooked. It was in a forgotten diary, tucked between the pages of an occult book, that she found a possible solution. Eliza had written about a twin mirror, a pair of which Emily possessed, which served as an anchor for her safety and control over the forces she had summoned. With Mrs. Alden's help, Emily located the second mirror, kept in a local Salem museum, supposedly just another antique piece of no particular significance. Together, they formulated a plan to access the mirror and perform a new ritual, this time with the intention of completely reversing the initial process. On the night of the ritual, with the second mirror in front of them, Emily and Mrs. Alden repeated the old words, but with the clear intention of ending Eliza's presence once and for all. The atmosphere was tense. Every shadow seemed to move, and every reflection seemed to hide threats. When the ritual ended, the silence that followed was absolute. Emily, exhausted, looked into the mirror. There was no figure, no shadow, just her own reflection, tired but relieved. "I hope that was enough," she said, more to herself than to Mrs. Alden. They left the mirror in the museum, now properly sealed with protective symbols. In the months that followed, Emily saw no more figures in the shadows or reflections. She began to feel safe again, although a part of her mind always wondered about the mysteries of the world she had touched. She knew that Salem would always have more stories to tell, but for now, she was content to just write about them, not live them. Story 2. The Unknown Hostel by Jack Turner. I drove my truck away from the main highway, driven by the search for something new to capture with my camera and share with my followers. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange and purple glow across the sky, as I followed a road that didn't appear on my GPS. The dirt roads weaved between gentle hills, and the dense vegetation sometimes prevented me from seeing the horizon. As I entered what seemed to be the heart of a small town, I noticed that there were no signs with the name of the place. The houses, worn down by time and covered in vines, seemed to whisper stories of a forgotten past. I decided it would be my home for the night, and looking for a place to spend the night, I spotted a small hostel on the side of the main road. The hostel was an old wooden building with a veranda that creaked with every step and foggy windows that barely let you see inside. The door was open, inviting or perhaps challenging visitors to enter. When I crossed the threshold, a chill ran down my spine, but I attributed it to the wind coming in through the gaps in the windows. The reception area was lit by a single pendant lamp that swung gently, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Behind the counter, an elderly woman watched me with piercing eyes. Her voice was a hoarse whisper when she asked how long I intended to stay. "Just one night," I replied, trying not to look as uneasy as I felt. She nodded, handing me the key to a room at the end of the corridor. "Dinner will be served soon," she said, an enigmatic smile curving her lips as she returned to her reading, an old worn edition of a book I couldn't identify. As I made my way to my room, the corridors of the hostel seemed to whisper with the echoes of hushed conversations. I passed a few ajar doors and caught glimpses of figures who quickly looked away as I passed. There was something palpable in the air, a tension that couldn't be attributed solely to the isolation of the place. After leaving my backpack in my room, I went downstairs for dinner. The cafeteria was almost empty, except for a couple sitting at a distant table and a lone man leafing through a newspaper in the corner. I sat at a table and watched as the hostel owner served steaming soup and homemade bread. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man next to me, asking him about the city and what he knew about the hostel. He gave me a cautious look, his eyes scanning his surroundings before whispering, "It's best not to ask too many questions around here." He quickly got up and left the cafeteria, leaving his soup untouched. That answer only piqued my curiosity, but also a warning. There were untold stories in this place, secrets that were perhaps better left uncovered. But I knew I couldn't ignore the truth, especially when every whisper and evasive glance seemed to contain clues to something much bigger than just a simple hostel in a forgotten city. During the night, the stillness of the hostel was interrupted only by the occasional sound of boards creaking under furtive footsteps. Lying in bed, I tried to fall asleep, but the conversation I'd had at dinner echoed in my mind. I decided to explore a little, guided by curiosity and the need to understand what was going on. I took my camera and a flashlight, left my room, and moved silently down the corridor. The walls seemed to breathe with ancient secrets as I passed, and every sound made me stop and listen. I came to an ajar door from which came a whisper of voices. I pressed my ear against the wood, trying to catch the words. "We can't trust him. He's new here. What if he finds out?" said a low voice, almost a hiss. "He'll leave soon like all the others," replied another with a resigned tone. I couldn't understand any more before footsteps approached, and I quickly made my way back to my room, my heart pounding wildly. Morning couldn't come quickly enough. At dawn, while the house was still asleep, I went down to the main room in the hope of finding some coffee. Instead, I found something that would change the course of my stay. Under one of the worn sofa cushions, my finger touched something hard. It was a small diary, covered in dust and with a worn cover. I opened the diary with trembling hands and started flipping through the pages. The entries were old, the ink faded, but legible. They told stories of travelers who had passed through the hostel, many of whom were never seen again after their stay. The writing was frantic, as if the author was in a hurry or afraid. One entry in particular caught my attention. It detailed a macabre ritual that took place every full moon, a ritual that required an outsider. I looked at the calendar on my cell phone, and a shiver ran down my spine. Tonight was the night of the full moon. I decided that I needed to get out of there before it got dark. I needed a plan. A sense of urgency grew inside me as the sun moved across the sky. I needed a plan to get out of the hostel before night fell. Determined, I began to discreetly explore the place, looking for alternative exits or anything that could be used in my escape. Walking through the corridors, I noticed an old building plan hanging on the wall near the kitchen. Studying it quickly, I discovered that there was an old system of service tunnels under the hostel, originally used for transporting supplies during more turbulent times. These tunnels could be my escape route. I prepared a backpack with the essentials: my camera, some energy bars, water, and an extra flashlight. My intention was to wait until everyone had gathered for whatever was going to happen at night, and then make my move. As day gave way to afternoon, the tension in the air became almost palpable. The other guests seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact, while the hostel owner supervised the preparations for the evening with a stern look on her face. It was now or never. As the sky began to darken, all the guests were summoned to a dinner that would precede the ritual. I took advantage of this distraction to slip to the back of the hostel, where the entrance to the tunnels was located according to the plan. I opened the door that led to the basement, and the cold, damp air welcomed me. I carefully descended the stairs, my flashlight lighting the way. The tunnels were narrow and full of cobwebs, with the smell of mold permeating the air. I could hear the muffled sounds of what sounded like a ceremony starting above me, which made me hurry even more. I followed the path I had memorized, dodging obstacles and trying to ignore the growing fear of being discovered. When I finally saw the light of the exit in the distance, my heart filled with relief. But before I could get there, I heard footsteps behind me. Someone was following me. I picked up the pace, almost running now, until I emerged from the tunnel into an open field, under the light of the full moon. The freedom of the fresh night air was sweet, but the feeling of safety was fleeting. I looked back one last time, seeing the silhouette of the hostel against the night sky. There was no sign of pursuit. Perhaps my escape had gone unnoticed, or perhaps they were too busy with their dark rituals. I ran across the field until I reached the road, where, as luck would have it, a truck driver was passing by. He stopped and offered me a lift, realizing my state of exhaustion and despair. As I drove away, watching the city disappear in the rearview mirror, I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. The city and the hostel seemed to disappear, as if they were just a passing nightmare. In the days that followed, I tried to locate the town on maps and search for it online, but there was no record of it, as if it had never existed. I kept the diary with me, a constant reminder of that night and the dark secrets that some doors once opened could never be closed again. Story 3: The Forgotten Garden by Alice T. The road that led to our new home meandered through gentle hills, flanked by trees that still bore the burden of winter. The house, an old Victorian mansion in Crestwood, Kentucky, stood imposingly at the end of a gravel-covered lane. James and I, tired but full of hope, crossed the threshold, leaving behind life in bustling Chicago. "It's going to be a fresh start, Alice," said James, depositing a box on the living room floor that still smelled of old wood and unfulfilled promises. I agreed, peering through the dusty windows. "And this garden, love, have you seen it? It has so much potential." the garden visible from the kitchen window stretched out like a verdant carpet dotted with wild bushes and weathered trees. Wild flowers wove chaotic patterns on the ground, and dead leaves danced in the March wind. "Let's make a project of it," I suggested, already imagining the Saturday mornings we would spend there, among tools and seeds. James, with his eternal optimism, just nodded, although his eyes betrayed a hint of reluctance. He had never been a garden enthusiast, but he knew how much it meant to me. We decided to start the following weekend. With gardening gloves and a new set of tools, we vowed to uncover and restore the forgotten glory of our new home's garden. The morning sun cast a golden light over the garden, revealing the imperfections and beauty hidden under years of neglect. While James concentrated on pruning the overgrown shrubs, I ventured deeper, pulling weeds and investigating every corner. My hands found something hard under a thick layer of leaves. It was a small wooden chest, partially decomposed by the damp, but still firmly closed. "James, come and see this," I called, my curiosity aroused. Together, we cleaned out the trunk and opened it, revealing its mysterious contents. Old photographs of a family I didn't recognize, yellowed letters, and some personal objects that seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. Each item was a fragment of a forgotten story, a puzzle waiting to be put together. "Who were they?" James muttered, holding up a photo of a couple in front of the same house, but with a vibrant, well-kept garden in the background. "I don't know, but something tells me that this garden holds more secrets than we expected." The intriguing discovery of the chest only increased our interest and determination to restore the place. It seemed that every bush, every stone had a story to tell. Over the next few days, our gardening project turned into an archaeological expedition. Each new discovery led to more questions, and we soon realized that we were unearthing not just roots and earth, but pieces of a past that someone had tried to hide. As the project to revitalize the garden progressed, the earth continued to reveal its secrets. One afternoon, while we were removing a pile of old stones, our shovels hit something solid that didn't look like stone or roots. Carefully, we cleared the area and discovered a stone altar covered in symbols we couldn't understand. "That looks ritualistic," James observed, frowning as he ran his fingers over the carved inscriptions. The symbols were strange, almost supernatural, and a shiver ran down my spine. We decided to document every detail with photos before continuing the excavation around the altar. We found more objects, used candles, small animal bones, and ceramic containers with residues of unknown substances. "We should talk to someone about this," I suggested, feeling that we had moved beyond a simple gardening project. James agreed, and the next morning, he contacted a local professor of anthropology and the occult, Dr. Harold Finch, who was deeply interested in our findings. Dr. Finch arrived on a Wednesday evening, carrying old books and a curious look on his face. We led him into the garden, where he examined the altar with a mixture of respect and caution. "You have discovered a site of ancient practices, possibly linked to forgotten cults," he explained, while shining his flashlight on the symbols. These rituals were performed to communicate with what they believed to be nature spirits or ancestors. Night fell as we listened to Dr. Finch's stories. The atmosphere became heavy, almost palpable, as we discussed the possible origins of the altar and what might have been practiced there. He suggested that we should be cautious, as such sites could be charged with residual energies. While we were talking, a sudden breeze stirred the surrounding trees, and one of the plants near the altar, an apparently dead rose bush, sprouted a single blood-red flower before our eyes. The phenomenon left us all silent, questioning the rationality of the scene. "This is a sign," said Dr. Finch, his voice a whisper. "You should be prepared for more occurrences like this." Frightened but intrigued, we agreed to continue our investigations. We decided to keep the garden under observation and install cameras to capture any unusual activity during the night. That garden, we realized, had much more to reveal. The following weeks brought with them an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. Each night was a vigil, with James and I taking turns to observe the cameras installed around the garden. The phenomena became more frequent and disturbing. Shadows that moved independently of the light, almost inaudible murmurs in the early hours of the morning, and plants that seemed to grow and wither to the rhythm of an invisible breath. "It's starting to freak me out," James admitted one evening, after we had reviewed the recordings that showed an inexplicable mist forming and dissipating rapidly around the altar. "Maybe we should stop." I felt the same unease, but my curiosity was stronger. "Just a little longer," I insisted. "We need to understand what's going on here." This decision, however, began to weigh on our relationship. Sleepless nights and constant fear brought discord and doubt, but also a strange sense of shared commitment to that land and its secrets. Our determination was put to the test when, at dawn on a full moon, a shocking event occurred. One of the statues in the garden, until then inert, was found the next morning upside down. There were no signs of human intervention, and the weight of the statue made it unlikely that it was the work of animals or the wind. Driven by the need for answers, we decided to hold our own ceremony in the garden, trying to replicate some of the rituals described in Dr. Finch's books. The idea was simple: to offer something to the garden in exchange for peace and understanding. We chose the following evening for our act, preparing offerings of local flowers and herbs. The night air was charged as we began, the moonlight filtering through the trees and illuminating the stone altar. We recited ancient words, each syllable feeling like a weight on our hearts. As the ceremony progressed, a cold breeze picked up, carrying with it a murmur that sounded like an answer. Suddenly, a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the garden. It was our neighbor, Mr. Harrow, an elderly and reclusive man who until then had shown little interest in us. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted, his voice laden with anger and fear. He went on, frantically explaining that we had disturbed something that should have remained dormant. According to him, his family had kept the garden under control for generations, and our actions had undone the bonds that kept the spirits at peace. "You have to leave, now," he insisted. In his hand, he held something that glowed in the moonlight, an ancient amulet, a symbol of protection. His urgency and terror were palpable. Faced with Mr. Harrow's fury and despair, and the increasingly intense demonstrations around the altar, James and I exchanged looks of doubt and fear. It was clear that we had started something that we might not be able to control. That night became a whirlwind of events that culminated in an inevitable decision. Under pressure from Mr. Harrow, and with a growing sense of danger, James and I knew we could no longer ignore the gravity of the situation. The garden, which had once seemed just an abandoned space awaiting renovation, was now proving to be a place where ancient, malevolent forces were awakening. "We need to put an end to this," James said, the determination in his voice hiding the fear I knew he felt. The only solution seemed to be to destroy the altar and everything around it. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing that by doing so, we were risking not only losing the garden, but also our safety and sanity. The next morning, armed with gasoline and matches, we prepared to set fire to the garden. Mr. Harrow watched from a distance, his gaze somber and resigned. He warned us that once started, the fire could attract even more entities to the place, but we were determined. As the fire began to lick the dried herbs and wood of the altar, a feeling of relief mixed with dread came over me. The flames rose quickly, lighting up the night and consuming the garden which, until a few weeks before, had seemed to be a place of renewal and hope. For a moment, as the flames danced around the plants and the altar, I heard something that sounded like a scream, a primal and desperate sound coming from inside the fire. James and I looked at each other, speechless, but aware that something deep and ancient was being released or destroyed in that instant. When the fire finally went out, all that remained was a field of ash and charcoal. The garden, which had been the center of so many hopes and fears, was now reduced to nothing. Mr. Harrow approached, his face a mixture of relief and sadness. "You've done what needed to be done," he said, before turning and walking away, leaving us alone to face the consequences of what we had just accomplished. The next morning, as the sun rose over what was left of the garden, James and I decided it was time to leave. Our experience there had changed us in ways we still didn't fully understand, but we knew that this place would never be our home. Before we got in the car to leave, one last look at the garden revealed something that made my heart stop for a second. Among the ashes, a small green sprout was emerging, as if the earth still held one last secret. We left Crestwood knowing that the story might never truly end. Story 4. The Voice on the Recording, by Ethan M. It was a quiet night in the small town where Ethan grew up. The streets were deserted, except for the occasional headlight of a passing car. Inside his childhood home, Ethan walked downstairs towards the basement, now transformed into his creative refuge. The space was small, cramped, with walls covered in cheap soundproofing and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In contrast, the glow of the LED lights from the recording equipment filled the room with a cold, electronic tone. Ethan adjusted his headphones, feeling the familiar weight of the unfinished song pressing down on his mind. His goal was clear: to finish the track he had been working on for weeks. It was a solitary process, but he always preferred it that way. The soft beats of the metronome set the pace as he adjusted the synthesizer, immersed in his world. The sound flowed through the cables to the speakers, filling the small space with a melancholy melody that seemed to reflect Ethan's very soul. He stopped to listen to the playback, analyzing every detail. It was then that he heard a sound, almost imperceptible, like a whisper. He paused, pressed the headphones against his ears, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Strange, thought Ethan, assuming it was just a glitch in the recording. Still, something about that sound caused him a subtle discomfort, a sensation he couldn't describe. He restarted the track, and this time the sound was there again, a whisper, distant but present. Switching off the equipment, he shook his head, trying to rid himself of the growing anxiety. Perhaps it was just tiredness, or maybe a glitch in the software. But as he climbed the stairs back to the main floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in the basement was trying to communicate. The next day, Ethan woke up with his mind still stuck in the strangeness of the night before. The morning was clear, but the weight of curiosity pulled him back to the basement. He needed to understand what had happened to his recording. With a cup of coffee in his hand, he went downstairs once more, the air in the basement now charged with a palpable nervousness. He reviewed the recorded track, moving backwards and forwards, his fingers drumming nervously on the table as he tried to identify the sound. When he finally located the exact moment, he heard what sounded like a voice, a faint voice, but undeniably present. "It can't be," muttered Ethan to himself. He isolated the audio track and played it over and over again. Each time he listened to it, the voice seemed clearer, more insistent. She wasn't just present, she was speaking. Trying to remain calm, he adjusted the audio settings, searching for a rational explanation. Interference, some radio transmission, maybe even some kind of feedback from the equipment. But none of these explanations seemed to fit. The more he listened, the more the voice seemed familiar. The discomfort he had felt the night before began to turn into something stronger, a deep unease. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that that voice was somehow connected to him, something he should remember, but which was buried deep in his memory. He spent the rest of the day trying to recreate the conditions in which he had captured the voice, recording new clips, adjusting microphones and devices. However, the voice didn't appear again in the new recordings, which only increased his frustration and confusion. As night fell and the shadows lengthened in the basement, Ethan felt exhausted, physically and mentally. He turned off the equipment and went upstairs, but the voice kept echoing in his mind, haunting him as he tried to sleep. Something was deeply wrong, and Ethan knew he couldn't rest until he found out what it was. Hours passed, but Ethan couldn't shake the voice from his thoughts. It was there, persistent, like a ghost hovering at the edge of his consciousness. The next morning, he found himself once again descending the stairs to the basement, determined to unravel the mystery that plagued him. He spent the whole day searching audio and recording forums online, trying to find some logical explanation for the presence of the voice. Perhaps there was a problem with his equipment, some external interference, or even an error in the software he was using. But none of the answers he found seemed satisfactory. The online community was full of theories, but none made sense to him. As the day progressed, Ethan began to feel more and more disconnected from reality. He rummaged through his studio, checking every cable, every microphone, every piece of hardware, Everything was in order, with nothing to indicate any anomalies. Even so, the voice continued to echo in his mind, bringing with it a growing sense of dread. Maya called that afternoon, worried about Ethan's silence. They had worked together on several songs before, and she knew when something was wrong with him. Ethan tried to explain what was going on, but the words came out muddled and nonsensical. Maya suggested that he rest, that maybe he was just stressed about work. She even offered to go to his house, but Ethan refused, saying that he needed time to understand what was going on. Night fell, but Ethan's obsession only increased. He couldn't get away from the studio. He couldn't stop trying to recreate the conditions that had captured the voice. Each attempt failed, and his frustration turned to despair. The voice didn't appear in the new recordings, but he knew it was still there, waiting, hidden in the shadows of his mind. Ethan's dreams that night were dark and disturbing. He found himself in the basement again, but this time the lights were off, and the only thing he could hear was the voice, whispering his name over and over again. The voice took him back to memories he'd rather forget, moments from his childhood that had been buried, but were now returning in full force. Ethan woke up sweating, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was beginning to penetrate the deepest layers of his psyche, and he didn't know how much longer he could resist. Paranoia took over his mind. He began to question everything around him, even his own sanity. Maya called again the next morning, insisting that he let her help. But Ethan was determined to solve this on his own. He knew that if he told her the truth, she would think he was going crazy. And maybe he was. Deep down, Ethan knew that voice was connected to something he had forgotten, something that was buried inside him. And now, it was coming back to the surface, ready to unearth secrets he wasn't prepared to face. In the days that followed, Ethan completely isolated himself from the outside world. He stopped answering calls, ignored messages, and locked himself inside the basement, plunging deeper and deeper into investigating the voice. With each new recording attempt, he waited anxiously for any sign of the presence that haunted him. But the voice, as if it knew he was trying to capture it, remained silent. Exhaustion began to take its toll. Ethan was consumed by obsession, barely eating or sleeping. His mind, already frazzled, began to play tricks on him. He could hear the voice, not only in the studio, but also outside. Sometimes during the day, he had the impression of hearing whispers coming from dark corners of the house or while walking through deserted streets at night. It was during one of these nights when sleep finally overcame him that the voice spoke directly to him again. In his dreams, Ethan was in the basement again, but this time he wasn't alone. The figure of a boy stood before him, motionless, with his back to him. The voice whispered, clearer than ever, "Do you remember me?" The boy turned slowly, and Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine as he recognized the face. It was him, but a younger version, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. The boy didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes was full of sadness and pain. Ethan woke up suddenly, the sound of his own panting echoing in the dark room. The dream seemed so real, so palpable, that it took him a while to realize where he was. But the persistent feeling that the voice was connected to his past didn't leave him. Determined to find out the truth, Ethan returned to the basement that morning, but this time with a new approach. Instead of trying to record a new track, he decided to revisit the old ones, the ones he had recorded years before, when he was still just a teenager experimenting with music. He hoped that, somehow, the older recordings might contain clues about the voice. Listening to the old tapes, Ethan was transported back in time. He listened to the songs he had composed in moments of joy, frustration, and sadness. But it was on one of these recordings, one he barely remembered making, that he found something that paralyzed him. In the background of the track, there was a voice, not the same voice he heard now, but one that was unmistakably familiar. It was the voice of his father, a man who had died years ago. The words were distant, almost imperceptible, but they were there, captured on the tape. Ethan remembered that night. His father was drunk, shouting about things that Ethan didn't understand at the time. But now, the words made sense. His father was talking about a secret, something terrible he had done, something he should never have found out about. Ethan turned off the recorder, his mind spinning. The voice that haunted him now was linked to that painful memory, to his father and the secret he had buried so deep in his subconscious. Ethan stood motionless, his father's words echoing in the darkness of the basement. The memories he had buried for so long were now resurfacing with overwhelming force. The sound of the voice on his recordings wasn't just a coincidence. It was a call to confront the ghosts he had avoided for years. What disturbed Ethan most was the fact that he had never really understood what his father was trying to tell him that night. He remembered feeling afraid, confused, and trying to block it all out, turning the experience into one of those memories that become vague and indistinct over time. But now, with the voice coming back to haunt him, he knew it was time to face the truth. Determined to discover the secret his father had hidden, Ethan decided to listen to the recording again, this time paying attention to every detail. With the headphones adjusted and the volume at maximum, he closed his eyes and prepared to face whatever was coming. His father's voice, although weak and distant, was filled with a pain that Ethan had never noticed before. The old man was talking about something he had done, something that would haunt him until the end of his days. He mentioned a name, but the interference and noise made it difficult to understand. "Ethan, you have to forgive me. I didn't know what to do. He didn't deserve it." The words came in fragments, but the message was clear. His father was confessing something that involved a person, someone he had hurt deeply. Ethan stopped the tape, feeling the weight of what he had just heard. Who was this person? What had his father done? And most importantly, why was this voice coming back now to confront him with these truths? Finding no answers in the basement, Ethan decided to scour the house in search of any clue that might shed light on what his father was trying to tell him. He rummaged through drawers, cupboards, and even the old trunk his father kept locked in his bedroom. It was there that he found a box of old documents, yellowed by time. Among them, there were letters, photographs, and a diary, all of which dated back to Ethan's childhood. As he leafed through the diary, his father's words began to make sense. He read about a neighbor, a man who lived next door, someone his father mentioned with respect and sometimes a hint of fear. The diary suggested that there had been an incident, something involving Ethan, still a child, and this neighbor. But the details were vague, as if his father had gone to great lengths to hide the truth, even from himself. Ethan's heart raced as he began to connect the dots. He knew he was about to discover something terrible, something that would change his view of his father and himself forever. With the diary in hand, Ethan felt that the truth was within his grasp, but he also knew that confronting this truth could have irreversible consequences. The voice that haunted him was now clearly linked to this buried secret, a secret that had somehow taken root in the recordings and in the house itself. Desperate to put an end to this storm, Ethan made a drastic decision. If the voice was linked to the studio, then destroying the studio would be the only way to silence it once and for all. He convinced himself that if he destroyed everything, the instruments, the recordings, the equipment, he could finally get rid of the presence that was haunting him. Ethan went down to the basement for the last time, but this time he wasn't looking for answers. He was there to destroy everything he had built. With a hammer in his hand, he began to dismantle his world. First it was the monitors, then the synthesizers. With each blow, he felt a mixture of relief and despair. The tracks, the tapes, everything was broken or torn apart, piece by piece. The sound of destruction reverberated through the basement walls, but inside Ethan there was a growing silence. He was consumed by anger and pain, but also by a sense of liberation. He believed he was finally facing his demons in the only way he knew how, by eradicating everything that could be feeding the voice. When the studio was completely destroyed, Ethan fell to his knees on the floor, panting. He looked around and saw the result of his years of work, dreams and hopes reduced to rubble. However, the silence in the basement was almost deafening. For the first time in days, he couldn't hear a voice. Ethan climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of what he had done. He believed that he had finally managed to silence the voice. But as he lay there that night, exhausted and empty, a doubt began to creep into his mind. What if the voice wasn't connected to the studio? What if it was inside him, a reflection of his own consciousness? As he closed his eyes, hoping for a peaceful sleep, Ethan heard, albeit distantly, like an echo, a familiar whisper, faint but unmistakable. The voice was still there, as persistent as ever. Ethan woke up the next morning feeling more tired than when he went to sleep. The destruction of the studio had brought him only brief relief, and now the reality of his situation was becoming increasingly clear. He had nowhere left to run. The voice, which he had believed to be trapped in the basement, now seemed to have taken root in his own mind. He spent the day wandering around the house, trying to find some peace, but the whispers continued, infiltrating his thoughts, interrupting any attempt to concentrate on something else. The voice wasn't constant. It appeared and disappeared, sometimes whispering his name, other times repeating fragments of his father's words. Ethan began to realize that no matter what he did, he could never really escape. That's when he decided he needed to get away from that house completely. There was too much weight there, memories, secrets, and now this persistent voice that seemed determined to torment him to no end. Ethan packed his things, taking only the essentials, and decided to move to a small cabin in the woods, away from the city, away from the memories. As he drove along the winding road that led to his new home, Ethan felt a strange relief when he saw his childhood home disappear in the rearview mirror. He hoped that the new environment, so different from the one where it all began, would finally give him the peace he so desperately craved. But even in the stillness of the forest, as night fell and Ethan prepared for bed, he heard again faintly, almost like a breath on the wind, the same whisper that had followed him. The voice wasn't connected to the place. It was inside him, and he couldn't just leave it behind. In the hut, away from everything and everyone, Ethan began to rebuild his life. He decided that if the voice couldn't be silenced, he would have to learn to live with it. The voice was part of him, a manifestation of the secrets he carried, the truths he had avoided. It was like an invisible scar, always there, but no longer as frightening as before. In the days that followed, Ethan started composing again. This time, his music had a different quality. Deeper, darker, but also more authentic. He let his voice guide his compositions, turning whispers into melodies. It was as if, by finally accepting the presence of the voice, he was releasing something within himself, allowing his creativity to flow in a way he had never experienced before. The isolation in the forest, instead of being an escape, became a space for reflection and growth. Ethan began to understand that the voice was not only a torment, but also a doorway to parts of himself that he had never explored. Each new composition was a journey into his psyche, a plunge into the depths of his emotions. One morning, when he woke up to the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, Ethan felt a new sense of peace. The voice was still there, but now it was a familiar companion, not an enemy. He knew this journey wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to move on. As he sat down at the piano, he began to play a new melody, one that didn't come from his voice, but from his own will. A new beginning, rising from the ashes of the past. Story 5, The Hotel on the Road, by Jack A., October 15th, 2023. We were returning home after a long visit to my parents. I, Jack, was behind the wheel, driving along a deserted road in the middle of nowhere while the rain fell heavily outside. Mary, my wife, was dozing in the passenger seat, and our children, Lucas 12 and Emma 10, were in the back seat, distracted by their books. The road seemed endless, and tiredness was beginning to weigh on me. The car's headlights illuminated only a small portion of the road ahead, while the dense darkness of the night enveloped us. I needed a break, and was about to suggest a sleepover in the car when I saw a sign for a hotel on the side of the road. "The Silent Pines Inn," said the sign, in faded letters that glistened faintly in the rain. I slowed down and entered the small gravel road that led to the hotel. The building looked like it had come out of another era, with its old wooden facade and large windows. It wasn't exactly what I expected to find, but it seemed safe, and more importantly, it offered a warm place to spend the night. I parked the car and woke Mary, who blinked in confusion at the hotel in front of us. "Let's stay here for today. I'm exhausted," I explained. She nodded with a sigh and woke up the children. We entered the hotel and were greeted by a tall, thin man with a peculiar appearance. He introduced himself as Mr. Whitaker, the receptionist, and led us to the counter. The interior of the hotel was surprisingly well kept, with a blazing fireplace and furniture that looked like it was from the 1920s. Everything seemed out of place, but I was too tired to care. After a brief check-in, Mr. Whitaker handed us the keys to the rooms, saying that breakfast would be served at 8 a.m. We took the keys and climbed the wooden stairs that creaked under our feet, ready to rest. When I entered the room, I was immediately struck by a strange feeling of déjà vu. The walls were decorated with flowery wallpaper and old framed pictures. Everything was perfectly tidy, but there was something undeniably strange in the air. It was as if time had stopped there, leaving everything frozen in a bygone era. Mary seemed to notice too, although she didn't say anything. She just looked around, her eyes taking in every detail of the room, before starting to pack up the children's things. Lucas and Emma, always curious, didn't take long to explore the hallway. While I was putting my things in the closet, I heard their low laughter and the sound of light footsteps running across the carpet. A few minutes later, Lucas came back into the room with a strange object in his hands. It was a diary, old and worn, which he had found on the floor of the hallway. "Look what I found, Dad," he said, his eyes shining with curiosity. I opened the diary, flipped through a few pages, and realized that it belonged to someone who had stayed at the hotel decades ago. The entries were short, describing daily activities, until something caught my eye. "Nobody here knows you're dead," was written in shaky handwriting with underlined letters. My first reaction was to think it was some kind of bad joke. However, the feeling of discomfort only increased. I tried to dispel the thought that something was wrong and convinced Lucas to put the diary away. "Let's leave it until tomorrow, son. It's late and we need to rest." I turned off the lights and lay down on the bed next to Mary, but sleep was hard to come by. My mind was racing, trying to ignore the strangeness that was beginning to accumulate. In the silence of the night, the only sound I could hear was the rain beating against the windows, and as I stared at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the place. I woke up early on October 16, 2023, with the gray light of dawn filtering through the heavy curtains. The hotel was completely silent, except for the sound of the rain that still persisted, now just a whisper. Mary was still sleeping next to me, but my mind was restless. I couldn't forget what I had read in Lucas's diary the night before. I decided to go down to the lobby and take a closer look at the hotel. Perhaps a cup of coffee would help dispel this strange feeling. When I arrived on the first floor, I was greeted by a surreal sight. The lobby was exactly as it had been the night before, as if no one had been there since we went to our rooms. The fireplace was still burning just as brightly, and soft 1920s music was playing quietly in the background, as if it were stuck on a loop. I went to the counter to settle the bill and leave as quickly as possible. When Mr. Whitaker appeared, I noticed that he looked exactly the same as before, with the same serene expression and the same old-fashioned air. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," I said, trying to sound natural. "We'd like to check out now." He smiled, but his gaze seemed to pass right through me. "Of course, sir. But why are you in such a hurry? Breakfast will be served soon, and there's so much to see and do here at the hotel." "We're in a hurry to get home," I replied, trying to end the conversation. "Could you please show me the bill?" Mr. Whitaker's smile didn't diminish, but he made no mention of moving. "Ah, sir, I'm sure we can arrange something. Perhaps an extended stay?" His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I decided I wouldn't extend our stay another minute. "No, thank you. We just want to leave." While I was talking, Mary and the children came downstairs, ready to leave. I grabbed our bags and led everyone out to the car. But when we walked out of the front door, it was as if the world outside had changed completely. The road we had arrived on had simply disappeared. In its place, there was just a thick layer of fog that seemed to engulf everything around it. I was paralyzed, trying to understand what was happening. I looked around for a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. Mary grabbed my arm tightly, concern evident on her face. "Jack, what's going on? Where's the road?" "I don't know," I mumbled, trying to stay calm. But the truth was that fear was beginning to overwhelm me. As if that wasn't enough, the cell phones had no signal, and the phones in the hotel were completely disconnected. "We're trapped here," whispered Mary, panic in her voice. "And that man, Mr. Whitaker, he's not letting us go." Lucas tugged on my sleeve, holding up the diary he had found. "Dad, I think this has something to do with what's written here," he said, his voice low but full of urgency. "We need to find out what's going on before it's too late." There was no other choice but to go back inside the hotel. Mr. Whitaker was waiting for us, still smiling, as if he already knew we wouldn't be able to get out. Back at the hotel, the atmosphere seemed even more oppressive. Mr. Whitaker led us back to the lobby, where he insisted that we have breakfast. Despite our discomfort, we sat down at the table, but the food seemed as old-fashioned as the rest of the hotel. Toast, homemade jam, and strong coffee, as if it were served in another time. I tried to disguise my anxiety as I chatted with the children and Mary, planning our next move. We needed to escape, but all attempts so far had been thwarted. When I'd finished my coffee, I decided to explore the hotel further, hoping to find some clue as to how to get out of the place. Lucas, always curious, insisted on accompanying us, with the diary firmly in his hands. Mary and Emma stayed in the lobby, waiting for us. As we walked through the corridors, I noticed that they seemed even longer than before, as if the hotel was expanding as we went along. We tried several doors, but they all seemed to lead back inside the hotel, as if we were walking in circles. In one of the corridors, we found a window, and I decided to break it to get out. I picked up a lamp and threw it against the glass, but to my surprise, it immediately sprang back to life, as if it had never been broken. "What's going on here?" I exclaimed, unable to hide the despair in my voice. Lucas looked at the diary and then at me. "Dad, I don't think the hotel wants us to leave." Lucas's words were disturbing, but they made sense. The hotel seemed like a living entity, determined to keep us trapped there. We kept walking, trying to find another way out, but each time we tried, we were brought back to where we started. It was as if the hotel itself was guiding us to where it wanted us to go. As we explored, Lucas started leafing through the diary again. "Dad, it says here that the hotel is stuck in a time loop, that all the guests are reliving the same day over and over again." "That can't be real, Lucas," I replied, trying to remain rational. "But if it is, how do we get out of here?" Lucas pointed to a passage in the diary. "There's a part that talks about a ritual. Maybe that's the only way out of here." The idea of a ritual seemed absurd, but given the circumstances, I was willing to consider anything. Before making any decisions, I needed to go back and discuss it with Mary. Perhaps together we could find a way out of this nightmare. When we returned to the lobby, Mr. Whitaker was waiting for us, as usual. "How was your exploration, Mr. Jack?" he asked, his smile more disturbing than ever. I stared at him, trying to decipher his true motives. "We're still trying to understand what's going on here." "Oh yes, the hotel can be quite intriguing," he replied enigmatically. "But don't worry, I'm sure everything will become clear to you soon." His response left me with a feeling that time was running out. We needed to act quickly, before it was too late. We returned to our room after the disturbing conversation with Mr. Whitaker. Mary was sitting on the edge of the bed, clearly trying to process everything that was happening. I could see the tension on her face, but before I could say anything, Lucas came in with the diary in his hands, determined to show us what he had discovered. "Dad, Mom, look at this," he began, quickly flipping to a specific page. "Here, in this part, the guest who wrote this talks about the fire that destroyed the hotel." Mary approached, and so did I, our eyes fixed on the old, faded words. The diary described a party night in 1923, where the guests were celebrating a special occasion. But the celebration ended in tragedy when a fire suddenly swept through the hotel, killing everyone present. The strangest thing was that, according to the author, the guests didn't know they were dead. They kept reliving that night, trapped in an endless cycle of repetition. "That's what's happening here," Mary whispered as she read. "We're in the middle of this cycle, and Mr. Whitaker, he must be part of it." "What do you think we should do?" I asked, trying to keep calm as my mind raced with questions. Lucas turned a few more pages until he found the passage that mentioned the ritual. "The only way to break the cycle is to perform a liberation ritual. This requires the spirits here to accept that they are dead and want to be set free. Mary shook her head, visibly upset. But how are we going to do that? These spirits don't even know they're dead. And who's going to help us? I was about to answer when we heard a soft knock on the door. We all froze for a moment, and then Lucas, being the bravest, went to the door and slowly opened it. Standing outside was a young woman, dressed in a dress that looked straight out of the 1920s. Her sad, empty eyes watched us, but there was something different about her, an awareness that the other spirits didn't have. "I can help," she said, her voice low and soft. "I was one of those who died here that night. But I know I'm trapped, just like everyone else. I can guide you through the ritual, but it will be dangerous. Mr. Whitaker won't let you do it." "Why do you want to help us?" I asked, suspicious but also hopeful. She looked at the ground, as if reliving a painful memory. "Because we don't deserve to be stuck here, nor do you deserve to be. I want it to end, for all of us." It was a difficult decision, but at that moment, it seemed that this young woman was our only hope. She explained what we needed to do. Perform the ritual at midnight, in the main hall of the hotel where the original party had taken place. We needed to convince the other spirits to take part, which would be the hardest part. "We need to prepare," said Mary, picking up Lucas's diary. "This may be our only chance." I agreed, and we began to organize ourselves for what was to follow, aware that our lives depended on it. Night fell quickly, and soon the hotel was shrouded in the same darkness that had seemed to hang over us since we arrived. I was tense, feeling the weight of what was to come. The young spirit met us in the corridor and guided us to the main hall, where the ritual was to take place. The children were frightened, but Mary and I tried to maintain a facade of calm so as not to alarm them even more. The hall was vast and oppressive, decorated with garlands and tables full of food, as if the party had never ended. The other spirits were there, laughing and dancing, totally oblivious to the fact that they were dead. The young woman guided us to the center of the hall and began to instruct Lucas, who would lead the ritual. "We need to draw a circle on the floor with this," she said, handing Lucas a handful of rock salt she had found somewhere in the hotel, "and then recite the words from the diary." As Lucas began to draw the circle, I felt a presence behind me. I turned and saw Mr. Whitaker standing at the entrance to the hall, watching us with an expression that mixed sadness and anger. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice icy. "We're trying to free everyone here, including you," I replied, trying not to show fear. "Free?" he repeated, as if the word made no sense to him. "I'm the guardian of this hotel. It was my responsibility to keep you safe. How can I allow you to ruin that?" Before we could react, Mr. Whitaker stepped forward, but the young spirit put herself between him and us. "You can't keep us here forever. We've suffered enough." He paused, hesitating, at which point Lucas finished the circle of salt and began to recite the words from the diary. The hall shook, and the spirits began to realize what was happening. Some tried to leave, but were trapped inside the circle. "No!" shouted Mr. Whitaker, trying to break the circle, but the young spirit held his hand. "It's time to end this," she said with determination. At the last second, before Lucas completed the ritual, Mr. Whitaker tried to pull him out of the circle. I threw myself between them, trying to protect my son. It was then that the young spirit, in an act of sacrifice, completed the ritual for us, freeing all the spirits, including Mr. Whitaker. The hall was filled with a brilliant light, and for a moment, everything was silent. When the light disappeared, we were alone, the hall empty, and the hotel beginning to crumble around us. "Run!" I shouted, and we all ran out of the hotel, feeling the walls shake behind us. We managed to get out of the main door, and, as we looked back, we saw the hotel disappearing into the mist, as if it had never existed. The cold night air enveloped us as we ran out of the hotel, the sounds of the collapse echoing behind us. Lucas held my hand tightly, and Mary was right behind with Emma, all of us driven by a primal instinct for survival. When we finally got far enough away, we stopped, panting, and turned to look at the place we had escaped from. The hotel, which moments before had stood there, imposing and frightening, was now just a silhouette fading into the mist. Little by little, it disappeared completely, as if it had been swallowed up by the night. The silence that followed was almost deafening. "He's gone, just gone," whispered Mary, still holding Emma close to her chest. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, or what we had just experienced. It was as if the hotel had never existed, as if it had all been a nightmare that we had just woken up from. Lucas was silent, but his eyes were fixed on the diary he was still holding. "Dad, the diary, it's changed," he said, his voice low. I took the notebook from his hands, and when I opened it, I saw that all the pages were blank. The only thing left was a simple sentence written on the last page. "Thank you for freeing us." The relief of having escaped that horrible situation began to mix with a sense of confusion and uncertainty. I turned to Mary, who seemed equally stunned, but also relieved that we were all together and safe. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice firm but full of emotion. I agreed, feeling that the best thing we could do was to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. We got back into the car, and with my heart still racing, I started the engine. To our relief, the road that had disappeared before was now in front of us, clear and illuminated by the headlights. Without looking back, I started driving, determined to get us as far away from that place as possible. As the car sped down the road, leaving what was left of the hotel behind, the silence inside the car was charged with emotions that neither of us seemed to know how to express. Lucas looked out of the window, still holding the diary, and Emma, exhausted, soon fell asleep on Mary's lap. No one said anything for most of the way. We were all processing what had happened, and the sense of surreality seemed to wrap around us like a heavy blanket. The only thing that mattered now was moving on, but we all knew that this experience would mark us forever. It was late at night when we finally arrived in a small town, where we found a simple motel to spend the rest of the night. The place was everything the Silent Pines Inn wasn't. Modern, functional, and completely free of any sense of supernatural threat. However, what happened on that road still hung over us like a shadow. While the children slept, Mary and I sat at the small table in the bedroom, still trying to understand what we had been through. "I can't get that place out of my head," she said, her voice a tired whisper. "What was that, Jack? How could something like that exist?" I shook my head, still without answers. "I don't know, Mary, but I know it wasn't an ordinary place. Maybe it was some kind of time trap, an echo of the past that got stuck somehow." She nodded, but the expression on her face showed that, like me, she was far from finding peace with what we had experienced. "At least we made it out," she finally said, trying to find some solace in the reality that we were safe. "Yes, and I don't think we'll ever fully know what that hotel was or why it was there, but I know we did the right thing by helping those spirits find peace," I replied, more to convince myself than anything else. Mary smiled softly, but it was a tired smile. "Let's go to sleep, Jack. We need to rest. We can think about it more tomorrow." I agreed, but even as I lay next to her, my mind couldn't switch off. The mystery of that hotel and what we had been through kept echoing in my head, and I knew that, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be able to forget it. The next morning, we got ready to set off. Before leaving, Lucas, still holding the diary, looked at me with a pensive expression. "Dad, is it really over?" I looked at him, understanding his doubt. "I think so, Lucas, at least for now." We got into the car, ready to go on our way. However, as I drove down the road, one last thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't over? What if this was just the beginning of something bigger, something that was beyond our comprehension? Lucas looked out of the window as we passed a bend in the road, and for a moment I would have sworn I saw a familiar figure on the side of the road. It was just an illusion caused by the light, or maybe my mind playing tricks. But it looked like Mr. Whitaker, standing there, watching us go by. I shook my head and drove on, without looking back. We had a long way to go, but something told me that this experience would never leave us completely.